For centuries, the difference between a man having statues erected in his honor as a national hero across the world's oceans and that same man being hanged as a villain to be fed to the carrion crows was reduced to a piece of paper weighing only a few grams. This was history's greatest and bloodiest illusion. On one side, medals gleaming amidst gunpowder smoke. On the other, rusted chains. Yet, when you stepped a little closer to the stage, you would see that the scenery never changed. The same ships, the same 24-pounder cannons, the same brutal methods of violence, and the same blood-soaked goods emptied from the ship holds. The only thing that changed was whether a government placed its seal upon this organized theft. If you had a signature from a king or queen in your pocket, you were now a privateer, a protector of civilization, a relentless defender of national interest. But if that paper was not with you, or if the wind had shifted direction due to a political treaty, you suddenly became a pirate. History would honor one with sagas of patriotism while burying the other at the gallows as a mere footnote. But the ocean recognized neither flags nor seals. It cared only for the weight of the corpses silently sinking to the bottom. Piracy, contrary to popular belief, was not a moment of systemic collapse, an anomaly, or an out-of-control explosion. On the contrary, piracy was the early modern state's most refined, most pragmatic, and most ruthless outsourcing project. And the closer you look at this reality, close enough to smell the stench of rotting meat in those holds, the more impossible it becomes to claim otherwise. Because for much of history, governments did not merely fight piracy, they viewed it as an investment vehicle. They licensed it, financed it like joint stock companies, debated its profit-sharing tables in palace halls, and when things turned politically ugly, they threw their pawns into the fire one by one. To have someone else commit the violence, to build palaces with the wealth brought by those bloody hands, and to call it law and order, that is the greatest marketing success in human history. To understand why piracy turned into a massive global industry, you must understand the tragicomic dilemma into which 16th and 17th century empires fell. This was as much a problem of capacity as it was a problem of cash flow. Global trade was exploding at a rate never seen before in history. Silver extracted from the depths of the Americas flowed into Europe via Spanish galleons. Spices, textiles, and opium from the mystic roots of Asia crossed the oceans. Sugar and tobacco had become the new addictions of the aristocracy. Profits were unimaginable. However, there was a massive obstacle in the way of these profits: distance and security. It took months for a ship to complete its route. Communication lagged an entire season behind events. When a ship was attacked in the Caribbean Sea, it took months for authorities in London or Madrid to even hear of it. And here the real tragedy began. No matter how wealthy and magnificent they were, no state possessed the resources to patrol every sea lane or provide a warship escort for every merchant convoy. Empires appeared gargantuan on paper, but in reality they were overstretched beyond their borders, gasping for breath. Building and maintaining a navy was the space program of that era. Constructing a single warship required thousands of oak trees, tons of rope, and most importantly, a massive crew that expected food every day and a wage every month. The maintenance of ships, the security of ports, the continuity of ammunition. For states, this had turned into an unsustainable cost item. And wars? Wars in that period were not an exception, but a way of life. It was at this exact point that the famous plausible deniability and cost-effectiveness came into play. States needed a way to project power cheaply, flexibly, and scalably without permanently allocating resources everywhere at once. Therefore, they cast ethics aside and turned to history's most morally flexible solution. They privatized violence. Governments began issuing those magical documents called letters of marque. Viewed through a modern lens, these documents were a freedom to commit crime, authorized by a state's own seal. This license granted a privately owned ship the right to attack the vessels of a nation that was an enemy of the sovereign, to seize them by force, and to plunder everything inside. The point to note here is this: the intensity of physical violence applied did not show even a millimeter of difference between a pirate and a privateer. Both groups attacked with the same ruthlessness, boarded ships in the same manner, and slit the throats of those who resisted in the same way. The only difference was that one had an authorization document in their pocket. This document transformed brutality into a military operation, and theft into national income. This was not chaos or lawlessness. This was the most advanced financial engineering of its time. Not a single penny left the state's coffers. The Crown did not pay wages, did not deal with ship repairs, and did not monitor whether the gunpowder was running out. All operational risk belonged to private investors. In the dark taverns of London or Saint-Malo, merchants, nobles, and adventurers gathered to raise capital to outfitting a ship. Captains recruited crews who had nothing to lose, ready to enter the most violent storms and the bloodiest conflicts. The system worked as follows. Investors provide the money and prepare the ship. The state issues the letter of marque and usually takes a processing fee for it. The privateers set sail and seize enemy ships. The booty is brought before an admiralty court. The court confirms whether the plunder is legal. Once approved, the cargo is liquidated, and the loot is distributed among the crew, the captain, the investors, and, most importantly, the state. This is the greatest privatized risk socialized reward model in history. If the ship sank or was captured, the state simply said, "sorry," and washed its hands of responsibility. But if the ship returned with a hold full of Spanish gold, the royalty filled its treasury without firing a single cannon. In short, the state moved the pawn. If the pawn won, the rook belonged to the state. If the pawn died, the state said that pawn wasn't ours anyway. Figures like Sir Francis Drake were the brightest stars of this system. To England, he was a sea dog and a national hero. Queen Elizabeth I celebrated Drake's raids on Spanish settlements and ships with official ceremonies. But to a merchant in Madrid, Drake was the most despicable murderer history had ever seen. However, England was not alone in this hypocrisy. This was a global playing field. France had turned the ports of Saint-Malo and Dunkirk into pirate nests. French privateers turned the English Channel into a death tunnel for enemy trade. The Dutch Republic financed its war of independence against Spain, largely thanks to these authorized bandits known as the Sea Beggars. Gold, stolen from Spanish ships, became the fuel for the Dutch struggle for freedom. The situation was no different in the Mediterranean. The Barbarossas and Turgut Reis, supported by the Ottoman Empire, may have been admirals of the state on paper, but operationally, they came from the culture of corsairing. Raids on Christian ships were not just a military strategy, but also a massive economic engine feeding the empire's wealth networks. Spain, on the other hand, was the greatest victim of this tragedy. Those massive silver fleets coming from the Americas were both Spain's lifeblood and the giant targets that whetted the appetites of its rivals. The more Spain tried to bring trade under centralized control, the more profitable piracy became. Ultimately, the turquoise waters of the Caribbean turned into a laboratory of authorized theft, where legality changed with the wind and loyalty depended solely on the gold in the ship's hold. The world is shaped not by those who talk more, but by those who plan better. Leave the show to others. Keep the real power for yourself. Old money, great wealth within silence.